The Sherlock Holmes Advent Calendar. The Redeemer's Coming. By Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Nora Godwin. Narrated by Peter Silverleaf. 20. Suspicions. Holmes remained silent as we leisurely walked back to our room to pack our belongings. I was, of course, aware that this was a clear sign of Holmes's feeling deeply uncomfortable. And I, too, had a strange feeling of disappointment at the outcome of our investigation, even though I had even suspected the right person. The abbot, both in a strange but also relatable way, had already sent a message to the Archbishop in London that the case had been resolved. He had also immediately arranged for Lestrade to be pulled off his work around the convent so that he could freshen up in time and leave with us. At this moment, the inspector must have been in the office room to officially declare the case as closed. In this respect, nothing kept us in the Abbey. While I was preparing our bags for an early departure, due to the now stable weather, trains were running regularly to London again. I was very much looking forward to our return to Baker Street for the holidays, so my decorations weren't for nothing. That's it, I explained as I finished packing and was ready to leave. We can go. But then Holmes said what I had been fearing all along. How can we really be certain that Brother Peter was the perpetrator? I'm not convinced. I sighed and put down our bags. Of course, I already knew that my reply was useless. Listen, Holmes, I began anyway. If a suspect who is investigated by the world's greatest detective commits suicide and makes a confession of guilt in the farewell letter, then these are quite overwhelming facts, aren't they? What do you want more than a confession? Real evidence, Holmes replied. There's something wrong here, and I'm not prepared to accept how this ended. But the case is closed, I replied. The file is being formally closed. Then we have to reopen it, Holmes said bluntly. The situation may suffice for the abbot and Lestrade, but not to me. Just remember, Watson, the vicar was a strictly devout Catholic, a fanatical admirer of Mary, unwavering in defending what he thought was the right faith. Would such a man oppose God? Would he take hold of the blood of the Messiah? It is hard to imagine. And on the other hand, if Brother Peter starts something, he brings it to an end. He's not the type of person who gives up rashly. Thus, the sudden suicide does not fit into the picture. Any resistance was futile. Well, I said resignedly, what do you want me to do now? Quite simply, Holmes replied with a confident smile. There is a fresh body in the basement, which is clearly a task for my best pathologist. Of course, I simply had to agree while I was holding my doctor's bag. Of course, we had to act quickly without informing Lestrade and the abbot in advance. We sneaked unnoticed into the basement where we had already examined Brother Emmanuel's body. In the meantime, 4 dead bodies laid in the cold room of the monastic catacombs. In addition to the first victim, Brother Emmanuel, Brother Nicholas, and Brother Peter, as well as our unfortunate coachman who died on our journey here due to the avalanche, were placed down there. Nevertheless, we immediately found the right table. Holmes pulled back the cloth that covered the corpse and exposed the vicar's torso. At first glance, annular reddish-blue discolorations on the neck were evident. I wanted to devote myself to this at first, because a death by hanging would be confirmed by these marks. I leaned the head of the dead man back and scanned the underside of the jaw and the neck area where there were abrasions, which had undoubtedly been caused by a rope. He was strangled, I noted in between. He has the usual marks from an unprofessional suicide on the rope. I slowly wandered down with my hands a little towards his Adam's apple. There, however, I made a most astonishing discovery. The larynx was under heavy pressure, I explained. A massive force must have affected it. The shield cartilage is broken. And that means? Asked Holmes, who already knew the answer. This man didn't hang himself, I had to admit. He was strangled by another person. The hanging on the cross took place post-mortem. It was murder. That probably means that we have to reopen the file, Holmes said. And my main suspect is rehabilitated, I added. I have to apologize, Holmes. You were right, of course, as always. But we had no time to lose, so Holmes refrained from triumphing and I from more self-criticism. What's next? I asked, and was in fact mostly in the dark. One thing is certain, Holmes replied. We can no longer trust anyone in this abbey. We were given a fake suicide, an alleged perpetrator who could no longer revoke his forced or fake confession as a dead man. This is an extremely perfidious plan, not only to get away with the murders with impunity, but also to be able to continue the experiments undisturbed. I take such a deception, which would almost have succeeded, to heart. The experiment, I repeated quietly. We would be helped if we could access this more accurately. Come on, Watson, Holmes said, demonstratively bored. Have you still not figured it out yet? Sorry, no, I confessed. Then you should take an example from me. Holmes taught me with a raised index finger, and read more often in the scriptures. I was finally confused and asked, why? The overall context would be of interest, Holmes said. Of course, none of the monks, especially our perpetrator, injected the blood of Christ himself. For the perpetrator does not want to put himself on a par with God. That would be an inexcusable heresy and also useless. But it is a question of enabling the return of the Messiah. But he does not simply descend from heaven, which would reasonably exceed the possibilities of our spiritual but earthly perpetrator, but the Messiah is born as the Son of Man. Do you understand? Unfortunately, no, I replied. Still not? Asked Holmes impatiently. My dear Watson, if the perpetrator has applied his experiment to the incarnation of the Messiah, what else does he need? You are a doctor, right? Where do the children come from? And then the scales fell from my eyes. A woman, I exclaimed. He needs a woman to carry out the coming Messiah. A virgin, to be precise, Holmes said, and she is undoubtedly hidden here in the Abbey. We have to find her. But where shall we go look for them? I thought aloud. Holmes was already one step ahead. In the secret corridors and rooms of the Abbey, he replied. While you enjoyed the local brandy with the Anglican reverend, I looked at the laboratory again. From there, another door, a trap-door to be precise, leads further underground. That's where we start. And when did you want to tell me that thing about the other secret door? I asked, a little annoyed. At first it seemed obsolete when Brother Peter was presented to us as the perpetrator, Holmes said. We assumed that he had used the blood of Christ for himself, but now I realize that there is still one person involved, and not voluntarily, as I assume. Suddenly another thought crossed my head. And this person will be Maria Taylor, I decidedly said. Her brother wasn't on the wrong track at all. He did not get in the way of the perpetrator by chance, but he pursued the perfectly right track here in the convent, disguised as a novice. And we'll pick that track up again, Holmes continued. It's nice to see that your ability to think has not completely gotten lost. We immediately made our way up, rushed through the aisles with Holmes still limping on his crutch, and quickly reached the lavatories. There, however, we came across Lestrade and Brother Paul, who in the meantime apparently got along quite well. They sat side by side on the toilet seats. "Ah, there you are," the inspector said, unmoved. "Everything is taken care of. We can leave at any time." "Nothing is done," Holmes replied immediately. "Brother Peter was not the perpetrator." "A new suspicion?" asked Lestrade, quite indignant. "Certainly," I corrected, shaking my head. "Forensically confirmed." The inspector made a bewildered face. "But who was it?" he muttered, irritated. "I don't know yet," Holmes replied, "but he holds a woman in a secret hideout, presumably Brother Emmanuel's sister. If you want to join us, Inspector, we are currently investigating." He pointed to the plank with which the monks had provisionally barricaded the hole in the wall leading into the laboratory. Lestrade didn't hesitate for a second. He quickly pulled up his trousers, jumped up from his seat, and began to remove the wooden boards. He commanded Brother Paul, "You keep watch here and keep them off our backs. Unless you are the perpetrator, you must tell us now before we make an unnecessary effort." The monk hesitated briefly and then stammered, "I? But no, I'll keep at my post. Very well." Lestrade, Holmes, and I then climbed through the reopened hole in the wall and reached the lab. The inspector ignited one of the gas burners and asked, "Well, where are we going?" Holmes pointed wordlessly at the large table from which Lestrade had just taken our light source. Underneath it was a small carpet, which my friend now shoved aside with his crutch, and under it was in fact a trap door. Lestrade and I immediately moved the table to the left so that the entrance was exposed. Then I grabbed the handle of the door and lifted it up. A short stairway could be seen leading down into the darkness. "Very fitting for a dungeon," I commented. Holmes ignored the remark and commanded, "Let's get down there, gentlemen. We will reveal more secrets down there." Although I did not comment, I was relieved when the inspector was the first to go ahead in the heat of the moment. I followed him carefully, and Holmes was at the end of our small group. Again, I assured myself that I was carrying my pistol. Lestrade was always armed anyway, and Holmes would use his crutch if he had to. Slowly, we climbed down the stairs, carefully, step by step. We reached a level and narrow corridor, which in turn soon led to a quite massive door. Lestrade pressed the handle, but it was locked. Using force was not going to be fruitful, since the door was heavily reinforced with iron beams. "Let me do this," said Holmes, unheedingly pushing past us. He pulled his keychain out of his pocket, which I knew included 3 lockpicks of various sizes. He started fumbling around the door lock, and within half a minute he had actually made it. The lock was unlocked. "Please, after you," he said, letting us step in first. When Lestrade hesitated, I took matters into my own hands. Slowly I pushed the handle of the door down and gently pushed it up. First, only a gap from which a diffuse light penetrated, then we completely opened it. We stepped through the door one after the other and immediately froze, even though we had been prepared for many things. But the sight that presented itself exceeded our expectations and our fears.